In the following seminar, organized by the Research Institute for Bilingual Learning and Teaching at the Open University of Hong Kong, Professor Jeannette Littlemore from the Department of English Language and Applied Linguistics at the University of Birmingham takes a closer look at some of the features of the visual language used in advertisements. Through their uses of metaphor, metonymy, irony, and other figurative constructions, what are these ads really saying? And how do they affect the people who watch them?
Yep, so I'm here today to talk about metaphor and advertising. I'm also here to talk a lot about metonymy as well. So before I get into the outline of the talk, just to very briefly introduce those two concepts. I take it most people here are familiar with the idea of metaphor, yeah, where you talk about one thing in terms of another. So if you go out of this talk and you say, oh, Jeannette, she was a real monster, that means that you're applying concepts from monsters to me. So I was like horrible, scary, awful, ugly, etc. Hopefully that's not what you will say. So the idea there is that with metaphor, you've got one thing being compared to another. I'm also interested in metonymy, and metonymy will also feature quite prominently in this talk. So whereas metaphor, you compare one thing to another, and it's two very, very different things, with metonymy, you're sort of using one entity to refer to another more closely related entity. So you haven't got this difference that you have in metaphor. So for example, people might talk about Hollywood to mean the American film industry, particularly the tacky end of the American film industry. Or they might use a 9/11 to refer metonymically to what happened on 9/11. Yeah? So these are metonymies. I'm going to be talking a bit more about that in the talk because I'm interested in the interaction between metaphor and metonymy in advertising. The project is called Exploring Multimodal Metaphor and Metonymy in Advertising. I'm going to talk today about two studies that we're doing as part of the project. The first study, looking at the different kind of the static adverts, the billboard adverts, what we're interested in here is the idea of figurative complexity. So when we look at adverts for things, we see that there's nearly always some kind of metaphor or metonymy. Sometimes it's very simple, as in this advert. This is an example of what we would describe as metonymy, because it's the Grand Canyon is simply standing for Arizona. So it's standing for something that it's very closely related to. Not very figurative, yeah? But as you move along the Cline, you get more and more figurative adverts, more complexity. So here, this is an advert for internet security, and you've got all the fences here, and you've got the security guards behind the fences, and then the whole thing looks like the internet sign. Yeah. So here you've got sort of a very straightforward single metaphor. Whereas here, in this advert for Audi cars, I don't know if you've seen this advert, it's on here you can see what? Yeah, so two eyebrows, yeah, or eyelashes maybe, yeah, eyelashes. So indicating that the car is, do they look like male or female eyelashes? Pretty quite female, yeah? So the car is a woman, so you've got that kind of going on. But do they look like anything else?
Dials?
Yeah, dials. Yeah, so for me, I would see these as speedometers, yeah? Now, for people who actually know more about cars than me, one is a speedometer and one is a rev counter, yeah? But I would see two speedometers here. And so there's a possibility of interpreting this as, because there are two speedometers, Audis are maybe twice as fast as the other cars. Yeah? So that's one interpretation you might have of it. Also, if you notice, there are no dials here. So there's speedometers, but there's no dial. So as we know in Germany, there are no limits to the speed on the motorways. So maybe Audi is unlimited speed. So in this one, it's easier to see multiple metaphors going on. So this is what we would say here is a metaphorical complex. So there's lots of metaphors going on in the single advert. And we're interested in looking at this continuum of complexity and seeing whether it affects people's appreciation of adverts, whether they are faster to understand the simple ones than the more complex ones, and whether people are able to see the complexity that we as analysts see. This is always a big issue in analysing metaphor. As an analyst, you look at it and you say, I can see this, 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 this and this, whereas participants would look at it and say, no, there's no metaphor there, I don't see it at all, because people will really vary in what they see as metaphor. So in this first study, we're looking at, does figurative complexity relate to speed of comprehension? And here we had adverts that we showed to English, Spanish and Chinese participants. And we were interested in, do they understand the simple ones more quickly than the complex ones? We theorised that they would. Does figurative complexity relate to the perceived effectiveness of the advert? So do people like ones which have lots and lots and lots of metaphor in them or not? Because advertising agencies obviously spend quite a lot of time and money putting together these adverts, so we want to know if they're effective or not. Does figurative complexity, as we perceive it as analysts, does that relate to how complex, how many different kinds of meanings people come up with when we give them to participants? So is there kind of validity in our own analysis? Does the perceived effectiveness relate to speed of comprehension? So is it that the faster people understand it, the more they like it? And then all of that, does it vary according to the linguistic and cultural background of the reader? So these are the research questions in this first study. For each advert, we have 4 measures. So we had 24 adverts in this study, and we rated them all first of all for figurative complexity, with 2 raters and a 3rd rater coming in to help in cases where we weren't sure. So this is basically how much metaphor and metonymy is going on in this advert. The second one, perceived effectiveness of the advert. So we showed people a number of showed them the adverts and asked them just to rate how effective they thought the advert would be. So it's perceived effectiveness. It's not actual effectiveness because we don't know how many people went out and bought the product as a result of this. That could be different. Speed of comprehension. So this is a reaction time study looking at how long it takes people to find the meaning in the advert. And the fourth one, complexity of understanding. So here what we did was we interviewed each of the participants and we asked them to say as many meanings as they could come up with for the advert, and we kept asking, saying, and anything else, anything else, anything else, until we became annoying and they just told us to shut up and move on to the next one. So there were our 4 measures. And this is the details. I should say this is the kind of an initial study that we're doing here. We've got a bigger version of it that I'll talk about in a minute that we're in the process of conducting. So 26 adverts, 30 participants, reaction time study. I don't know if any of you have used this DMDX software for reaction time. We were really excited because it was free and it was online and we downloaded it. Utter nightmare to use. I wouldn't recommend that people use it in future. It involves a lot of computer programming and things. There are now other packages that you can use which are much easier. Effectiveness ratings and interview data, which we analysed using this UAM corpus tool, which I will give more information about later on. It's also this is a really good free download, which I will talk about later on, for analysing this kind of data. So we basically calculated correlations between the different variables, and our first hypothesis was that figurative complexity would relate to speed of comprehension. Absolutely not, no relationship at all. So we were wrong here, and I think thinking about it, there are all sorts of reasons why that is the case, because it could be that even though an advert is complex, the minute people reach one understanding, they're fine with it. They don't need to go on and understand all of the meanings in the advert. So people maybe don't necessarily process all of the metaphors that are in the advert. Does figurative complexity relate to the perceived effectiveness of the advert? So remember, our hypothesis here was that the more complex, the more people would think it was effective. Well, yes, there was a relationship, but it was in the complete opposite direction to what we predicted. So here, again, we were wrong. So the more complex the advert, the less people liked it. I think this is quite interesting because it says to advertisers that they put all this time and effort into making a figuratively complex advert. People don't particularly like it, and they don't spend any time trying to understand it. Anyway, so it's quite interesting findings for the advertising agencies that we're working with here. The third thing, a bit more reassuring, our measures of figurative complexity, they related strongly to those of the participants produced. So this is good because this suggests that when we as analysts identify metaphor and metonymy, there is a correlation between what we and the participants in the study see in the adverts. And so that was reassuring. We weren't just kind of making up our own views of what's in there. Does the perceived effectiveness relate to speed of comprehension? Yes. So the ones that the participants liked, they understood very quickly. So it could be that because they understood them quickly, they liked them, or because they liked them, they understood them quickly. It's with correlation, you never know which is the cause and which is the effect. But it seems to be that the overall sort of take-home message from this early preliminary study is keep it simple with figurative complexity. It's a shame for us metaphor specialists because we love to see lots and lots of metaphor, but it's saying perhaps it's not a good idea to have lots and lots of metaphor. They were the first 4 questions. Now, as I mentioned, we were looking at this, we gave these adverts to English, Spanish and Chinese participants. And we were interested in kind of different responses that they gave. And what we found here was that of the participants, the Spanish were the most enthusiastic, the most positive responses to the adverts. The English, kind of medium, and the Chinese also sort of not so positive towards the adverts. And this, interestingly, correlates with findings in the literature that have also looked at positivity biases in language in general, and they're in the same order as those, which is quite a strange thing, I think. Just as an example of the responses, here we have the Audi advert again. Here we have the significant differences between the types of responses. So the Chinese participants are more likely to talk about it having unlimited possibilities. English, very typical of us, we talk about saving fuel. Okay, so not wasting too much petrol. And the Spanish, super enthusiastic, their Audis are friendly cars, so that's a kind of positive thing. Some of the more qualitative findings from this study now. This is an interesting one. This is for Nivea. Can you see what's going on here? What's in the here? Yeah, like a pause. Good, yeah. So interestingly, the Chinese participants saw a power socket. Because it is in China, this is the power socket. Yeah? But it makes sense. It makes sense because then the power socket gives you electricity, energy, and keeps you going for longer. So this is the thing about, once you put a meaning out there in a metaphor, in an advert, you've no really control over what people are going to understand by that meaning. And that becomes increasingly apparent as we do these kinds of studies. You can't predict what people are going to see in these adverts. Also, the Chinese are more likely to comment on the significance of the blue colour as well, which I think there could be cultural reasons for that. We're not sure. We don't want to kind of, in the study, we don't want to generalise too much, but we just want to sort of illustrate that there are very big differences in terms of how people see these adverts. And the last one, this is also Audi. So you see marriage here, and then Audi, which is a bit stronger. And here the rings are interlinked, whereas here they are just sitting on top of each other, so not as close a relationship. So the English and Spanish are more likely to notice that they're not linked, so owning an Audi is twice as good as being married, whereas the Chinese are more likely to say that love for the car is an emotional or powerful relationship. Again, these differences. It's quite nice. It sort of illustrates how useful this tool is for showing differences in interpretations. Some of them you can kind of explain or kind of attempt to explain. Other ones like this, it's very difficult to say why this is, but I think it's useful for advertisers to have this kind of information when they're putting their adverts out there. So they're the different interpretations. What we're doing now, this was a study with just 30 participants and with 24 adverts, and it had some things in the study that were not so good. So one problem possibly with the study is that all the adverts were in English. So the poor old Spanish and Chinese were obliged to read the adverts in English. This could have had all sorts of impact on the reaction times and everything. So we're running a bigger version of the study with 90 participants, 30 adverts. People have been looking at, because we've collected the data, we haven't analysed it all yet. People are looking at adverts in their own language, so we translate them into their own language, and they're doing it in their own countries, so it's not in the UK. We're doing the study in China, in Spain, and in the UK. So here we've got more participants, adverts in the L1, translated with the same typography and the colours retained. So here, this is a really nice advert from China for light bulb. And so that's what the Chinese people see, the English people see this, and the Spanish people see a Spanish equivalent. So lazy, replace it immediately. This is nice because it has lots of examples of, there's a metonymy here, because you've got the tie and the trousers providing kind of mental access to the idea of a businessman, yeah. But you've also got the metaphor in that the kind of fat light bulb is compared to the fat belly on the businessman. So you've got both things here. It's going to be in the participants' own countries. A wider range of figurative operations, so not just metaphor and metonymy, we're also including some hyperbole here. So this is a lovely advert, again from China, an advert for, well, what do you think it's for? I would have thought detergent at first. It's actually for insect repellent. Because, yeah, it's nice, isn't it? So the insect repellent is so strong that you're completely disappeared. So here you've got hyperbole. You're not there as well. Another thing we're building into this study is this individual differences variable of need for cognition. So need for cognition, it's been shown that there are some people who are perfectly happy with the first understanding and then that's fine, and then they go away. Yeah. Other people who need to see more, who want to think more, want to process more of the advert. And so we think that this was probably a variable that was quite strong in the preliminary study, but we didn't look at it in detail. So this time we've included a questionnaire, a need for cognition questionnaire. So it has things like this. I would rather do something that requires little thought than something that's sure to challenge my thinking abilities. I'm not sure if many people would click yes to that, but that's a kind of lack of need for cognition question. And then I find satisfaction in deliberating hard and for long hours. And there are lots and lots of questions like this. One issue with this is it's self-report data, and with self-report data you never really know how accurate it is. But still, we think it will provide an individual differences perspective on the study that wasn't in the pilot. And then the next thing that we're doing as part of the EMMA project, so the Exploring Multimodal Metaphor in Advertising, and this moves me on to the second part of the talk, is this focus on viral videos, these videos that have gone mad, yeah? And also, even though we haven't analysed the findings yet, we're looking at the role of emotion. So we're using one of these things, these kind of scary looking things that you attach to people's hands, EDA, electrodermal activity. It basically allegedly measures a person's emotional response to a stimulus. And it's measured basically by measuring the amount of sweat that's produced on their hands, yeah? And then that creates an electric current, and that shows how strong an emotional response there is to the advert. There have been studies showing that when all other things being equal, people respond significantly more strongly to metaphor than they do to literal language per se. But we're interested in why that is. Is it because it's just metaphor, or is it the content of the metaphor that we're looking at, or is it personal things that they're bringing it to? So we're going to interview as well as doing that. But moving on to this side, the viral videos, this is how viral videos have been described. And I think they're increasingly popular in branding and marketing. So I just like this quote: "A digitalized sneeze that releases millions of tiny particles that can infect others who come into contact with them." So the idea that it just goes worldwide, it goes mad. Yeah. Just to contextualize what we're doing a little bit, so we're interested in the role of figurative operations, so metaphor and metonymy, in why things go viral. But that is never going to be the whole story. I think there's the key thing of who's in the video. So if you can get someone really, really famous in the video, it's more likely to go viral. We haven't got any control over that. But that costs a lot of money, yeah? The same with the environment. Adverts that first feature at the Super Bowl in the US also tend to go viral because millions of people see them already around the world. But what we're interested in, the thing that we can think about, is the message. So what's actually in the advert? So even though we're going to be saying things about metaphor and metonymy and how they affect the popularity of adverts, that's never going to be the whole story. It's just going to be part of it. We think that there will be an effect because in other aspects of advertising that are not viral, figurative operations, this is particularly metaphor, have been found to increase brand recognition, recall of the content of the advert, and consumer preferences. And I can dig out the literature for that if anyone's interested in. So there has been a literature on the static advert showing that metaphor does help advertising. But we're interested in, so we're saying yes, the presence of metaphor and metonymy we think is going to be important. We're moving this study out a lot more. Whereas the previous study focused mostly on metaphor and metonymy, here we're looking at a range of figurative operations, which I'll illustrate with videos in a minute. So we're looking at things like hyperbole and also understatement and irony, different types of irony in the advert. So we're looking at a range of figurative operations. We're looking at how densely packed they are, how much they spread over the advert, what they are, and the positioning. So there have been studies that have shown when you give people a list of things to remember, people tend to remember the first one on the list, well, this is me anyway, and the last one on the list. and everything that's in the middle people tend to forget. So, yeah. So we've got the hypothesis that if the figurative operations appear at the beginning, at the end, maybe they're more memorable, maybe they're more effective. So that's part of our hypothesis. So in this study, what we've done is we've got 40 videos with differing views. So we've got, some of them have just got very small number of views, and others have had millions of views. So they vary in terms of the viralization. 2 raters, and then we brought in a third person where we disagreed. It's actually quite difficult. Whereas identifying metaphor and metonymy is hard, identifying metaphor and metonymy and hyperbole and understatement and irony is a bit of a nightmare. So it's very, very tentative pilot thing here. And then statistical analyses to establish whether viralization is connected to all of these things. So we're just looking for relationships between these aspects of figurative language and whether they're likely to go viral. I've put this here because I mentioned this to my brother-in-law who works in advertising, and he just said, you're looking for the Holy Grail here. You're never going to find it. Everybody would like to know what it is about an advert that makes it go viral, because then that, you can line your pockets with gold. But so we don't know if we're going to find the Holy Grail, but we're going to look for it anyway. So he's not put us off. So this is the data collection. These are the videos that we gathered. The figurative operations. So I'm going to take you through each of these by showing you examples of viral videos that have got them in. So with metaphor, so this is basically where one thing was compared with another. There are 2 key types of metaphor that people talk about in the literature. So there's resemblance metaphor, where something looks like something else. So when you go away from the session and say Jeannette was a monster, it could be because Jeannette looked like a monster, or Jeanette's behaviour resembled a monster in some way. Yeah. Looked or sounded or was. Correlation metaphor, these are metaphors that are kind of a result of our interaction with the world, our bodily experiences with the world. Some people may have heard this idea of conceptual metaphor. It's quite similar to that. So for example, things like when we talk about moving forward in time, it's almost like we're moving forward in space. Yeah? So we're looking forward to tomorrow, we look back to yesterday. And these are correlational things because they correlate our experience, it physically correlates with our experience in kind of more abstract way. Another example of a correlational metaphor would be good things are up and bad things are down. Yeah? Or closeness, affection is warmth. Yeah? So these are kind of more profound metaphors. And our theory was that maybe these correlation metaphors would have a stronger effect than the resemblance metaphors because they're more experienced, they're more felt. Metonymy, so here we're looking at sort of one thing standing for something that it's closely related to. Hyperbole, so massive exaggeration, and the opposite of that, understatement. Irony, verbal irony, situational irony, and dramatic irony. So verbal irony would be basically when you're sort of saying something which isn't, is kind of the opposite of what's expected, or it's not what's expected. Situational is when something unexpected happens, and dramatic is when the audience knows something that the person in the advert doesn't. So there's a lot of humour derives from irony. And the last one, just unmarked contrast. So this is just a change, but not necessarily experience any of these other figurative things. And then what we tried to do was to identify all of these operations in the language, in the images, and in the music that came in the advert. Because the advantage of these adverts is that you've got the sound as well. So you've got lots of ways of incorporating figurative operations. To illustrate some things, metaphor, here we've just got, this is not a video, this is just a very straightforward resemblance metaphor. Here, this is an advert for the World Wildlife Fund. Killing a tree is murder too, and you can see that the tree looks like a person. Okay, so it's like killing a tree. It's like can you see? It's like a person, not a person with their head chopped off. I don't know anybody who looks actually like this. So anyway, it's like a tree without the head. Correlational metaphor. Remember, I said this is the kind of thing like life is a journey, or up is good, or affection is warmth. This is an advert that we determined between us that contained a kind of correlational metaphor of life is a journey. So moving forward through time is moving forward through space. I'm just going to show you a little bit of this advert now.
It was my choice. And now I will question myself for the next few weeks, maybe months.
We had an option of 2 pathways to walk, and they led to 2 doorways. It was a bit confronting, actually, to be honest, to see these big signs and feeling like you had to choose and be self-conscious of how you perceive yourself and perhaps if it lines up with how the rest of the world perceives you.
I went through the average door.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I didn't even hesitate.
Okay, you've got the picture here. So basically there's this idea, like, you choose your path in life, whether you're going to see yourself as a beautiful person or an average person. It's strange, isn't it? Strange advert. And the message is that we should all see ourselves as beautiful. Is it for Dove? Yeah. So that's an advert with correlational metaphor in it. The next one is metonymy. A is 4B. So here you've got something represents. So here you've got the idea of a trigger providing a kind of like mental access to a bigger thing to which it's related. Okay? So this, in terms of those people who, I know there's a few people in the room working on metonymy, this is a kind of part for whole metonymy. Within the metonymy literature, people sometimes draw this distinction of part for whole metonymy, where one part of something represents the whole of it. So somebody might say to you that you're at a party, they're pouring wine, and they say, would you like a glass? And you say, yes, I'd like a glass. If they just gave you a glass, you'd be very disappointed. Yeah, the glass means like the glass with the wine in it. Yeah. Or if you're moving, if I say I need to move this table and it's really heavy, I might say I need some muscle. If some muscle just came and sat there, it wouldn't be. So it's kind of some muscle. It means the whole. And whole for part is the opposite of that. So here would be, say for example, staying with the alcohol theme. You get home really tired from work and you say, I need a drink. Somebody gives you a glass of water, you're disappointed. Yeah, because a drink it is a general term, but actually you mean an alcoholic drink. Also for whole for part, people might talk about, say for example, there's been an accident, and in English we would say the police turned up. Now that sounds quite sort of neutral in English. That means the whole of the police stands for maybe 1 or 2 policemen. In Greek, that sounds really wrong apparently, because that does actually literally mean the whole of the police force. So we use this part for whole and whole for part. So this is an example of one for part for whole, and it's for New Zealand Airways.
Wings Air Middle-earth flight. Before we set out on our journey, I would like to impart a story of safety.
Okay. Yeah. So here, you can see that immediately the music comes on, and that's all the metonymy for Lord of the Rings. Immediately, a lot of people are going, ah, yeah, get that. And then you see her, and she's also leads you in a bit more, and then you see all the characters, and you're right in. So this is an example of metonymy working. It also, and this is what we really often find in these kind of adverts, it also then leads on to a metaphor. Because here the journey on the aeroplane is a bit like, well, hopefully not, a bit like the quest in Lord of the Rings, hopefully less dramatic than that. But you've got this metaphor going on as well. It's really often that you find metaphor and metonymy occurring together. It's not often that you have metonymy just on its own. So that's a metonymy. The next one, this is a lovely advert. Hyperbole, massive exaggeration, something that you just wouldn't expect at all. And here, there's some hyperbole. Oh, well, you'll be able to see it occurs at a certain point in this advert. I won't spoil it for you, but you'll know when you see it. Okay?
And there's your beautiful baby.
Any day now.
Really? You're eating Doritos? He's eating Doritos on my ultrasound. Do you see what I have to do?
I know.
Give me that.
Okay, so as you can see, the hyperbole is at the end there, because that would never happen. So that's an example of hyperbole, and that's one of the things about the figurative operation appearing at the end of the advert. The next one, understatement. So here is when people sort of massively what they say is much less dramatic or much less impressive than what you're expecting them to say. And here is an advert where there's understatement right at the end of the advert. This is an advert. Okay.
This aisle isn't big enough for 2 zeros.
Anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Anything you can be, I can be greater. Sooner or later, I'm greater than you. Any note you can reach, I can go higher.
I can sing anything higher than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No,
yes,
you can't.
Is that all you got?
I'm up to my knees in 0 calories. Pepsi to the max, so let's drink all of these.
What's Snoop doing here?
We're tight.
Pepsi Max, 0 calories, maximum Pepsi taste. P-E-P-S-I Max.
Okay, so it's just that end bit. You see how the hyperbole, and then at the end, what's Snoop doing here? We're tight. We're friends. So we're tight. Just 2 words. So you normally expect more of an explanation here, something stronger, but just we're tight, and that's all, to explain this whole thing. So you've got the contrast there between the hyperbole and the understatement. Moving on to the 3 types of irony. So there's just the 3 types of irony to go next. Verbal irony, so this is where people say something that's kind of perhaps the opposite of what they mean, or different from what they mean. I'm just going to show you the beginning. This is the man on The Man Your Man.
Hello, ladies. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now back at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he isn't me.
It's that, sadly, he isn't me, yeah? Actually, he means, I'm quite pleased he's not me, yes? So it's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect. Situational irony, this is where something unexpected happens. I'm just going to show you a little bit of this one. An advert for Evian that you may recognise.
I'm the lyrical gangster. Big up the crew in the area. Still love you like that.
Okay, so that there you've got something unexpected happens. So you're expecting to see a visual of them, and it's not them. Okay. The third type of irony, dramatic irony, is where we as a viewer are aware of something that the person in the advert is not aware of, and that creates kind of humour and tension. And just to show the dramatic irony, horrible, it's cool. So you get the picture there. We were aware of something. And the very, very last one, before I come on to the analysis of these, unmarked contrast is just when there's lots of sudden changes, but it's not necessarily figurative in any of these other ways. And this is an example of an unmarked contrast. So here, what we've just got is lots and lots of sudden scene changes, one after the other. Because we were interested in a lot of these figurative operations, we've got this idea of contrast. Is it because they're figurative that they're popular, or is it because of the contrast? So this is to allow us to just to rule out the contrast. So that was the fun bit with all the talk. And that's just a summary of what we're interested in. And we're interested in the number and the percentage of these, so the coverage and the amount of these operations. So remember this advert for the baby, for the Doritos? This would be an example of how we coded this up. So all the way across we've got situational irony in the words and in the pictures, because there's all sorts of unexpected things happening one after the other in this advert. Metonymy and metaphor at the point where the baby starts playing ball with the dad, because you've got the metonymy in the Doritos is starting to represent the ball. No, the metaphor, the visual metaphor where the Doritos is representing the ball, and then the metonymy where that stands for the whole sort of father-son relationship that is yet to come. Unmarked contrast, where we have the kind of sudden change in scene, and then the hyperbole right at the end when they're all screaming, yes, and hyperbole in the verbal and in the image. So that's how we marked that one up. That's an example of how we marked them up. So we've got this dynamic thing. It shows whereabouts they occurred in the screen. In terms of coverage, so here, because we have this visualization of when they occurred, we're able to see the percentage of things that's covered. So here we've got situational verbal irony. Here we've got, this is 76% of the advert plus another kind of 10%, and so we can see how much of the advert contains some sort of irony. And then here, this one is for hyperbole, and how much of it is in the advert. So this is kind of like how much of these are in the advert. In terms of density, what we did here, so with density, we see how many of the different figurative operations are occurring at a particular time. So this is a little bit complex, but basically we've got the 4 quadrants of the advert, and in this first quadrant, divided again into 4. In this first part, there's irony here, irony, some metonymy, some irony, situational. So we added up and got a total of 12 instances of kind of figurative operations. And here there's more. There's 14, then 10, then 7. So this gives us kind of how much of it is co-occurring at once. So basically, the take-home thing there is how much does it spread across the advert, and then how densely packed is it, that we were interested in, and then where does it occur in the advert. And for the dependent variables, that's the number of views. So our findings, our main finding was that in terms of coverage, so how much does it spread across the advert, the big predictor, so there was prediction overall for figurative operations as a whole, but the big predictor of popularity is irony. So the ones that are most popular are the ones that contain irony, dramatic irony in general, so verbal, visual and musical, but also situational irony in images and situational irony in pictures. So irony overall is really important in these adverts. Dramatic irony, so where the viewer knows something that the person in the advert doesn't. I think that's because that creates humour. And humour is a very, very difficult thing to measure kind of objectively. Irony is kind of easier to identify, but the humour comes out of that. And a situational irony as well, so the unexpected things happening. The other big second predictor in terms of coverage was hyperbole. So something massively exaggerated and strange. When people see visual hyperbole, particularly, it's the big thing. So in terms of coverage, we've got irony and hyperbole, and coverage overall is significantly positive. In terms of density, in terms of how many figurative operations are occurring together at the same time, we found here that actually the more that occur at the same time, the less popular it seems to be. And that kind of maps back to our first study, showing that if there's a lot of different things going on in the same time, people perhaps don't like that so much. Perhaps it's just too much going on at once, too much to process at once. So we've got different kind of ways of explaining these findings. The irony creates a surprise effect because of the contrast involved, and the exaggeration or the hyperbole enhances this feeling. We think that's what's going on there. And the images engage the emotions more than words. So it seems to be images seems to be the key thing here. One reason why we've got perhaps the irony and the coverage is important, but the density is not so important. It relates to this idea of this optimal innovation hypothesis. I don't know if any of you have come across this. It's quite interesting, proposed by Rachel Giora et al. And this idea is that people don't like things if they're very simple. They don't like things if they're really complex. They like things that are sort of in the middle, particularly for where figurative operations are concerned. So if things are very sort of literal, it's not appreciated. If it's massively figurative, maybe not. But if it's kind of got an optimal amount, then it becomes something that people will appreciate. Another reason for our findings is that we think, when we looked back at our data, we found that irony behaves differently from metaphor and all the other figurative operations. It tends to come in longer strands. You tend to get this irony running all the way through the advert, whereas metaphor, you get a sample here, one here, one here, one here, and one here, which is why we get the coverage linking with the irony, I think. And whereas metaphor and metonymy come in sort of shorter, snappier things, as you can see in this article. In terms of positioning, when we look for correlations, so overall correlations and then individual ones, between where the figurative operations were and whether that correlated with popularity, we did indeed find that when there's a lot of figurative operations at the end and at the beginning, they tend to be the more popular adverts than the ones where it all occurred in the middle. And that relates back to what I said at the beginning of the talk, where I talked about this remembering things that are the beginning and the end of the list. In psycholinguistics, in psychology, people talk about the primacy and recency effects. So if something's recent or at the beginning, people remember it. So our findings tended to converge with that. So our next steps are to attach the meters. Our meter doesn't quite look like this, it's a different one, but to attach the electrodes and get the details of how people are responding emotionally, because we're getting here, this is quite interesting. This is kind of, from the first study, it was kind of self-report data, like how popular people, how good people thought it would be, how effective people thought it would be. From this study, it's actual real kind of comparing it to how popular the adverts are. But for the next step is to look at actual online responses as people are experiencing the advert. We did a very nice exhibition in Brussels because this was part of the EU project. We had lots and lots of school children. They came in and they watched the adverts with the electrodes on them. And we could see very, very clear evidence of some of them, like electrodes shooting up. One thing that was quite interesting that we found that I think will affect the study design is that at first we had the children wearing headphones so that only they could hear the advert, and there weren't very strong effects. But when we took the headphones off and all of their friends were around them, the effects were much, much stronger. And I think this shows the social effect of how emotion is a social thing. It's experienced. When all of their friends are experiencing it as well, there was much more of a correlation between the dramatic things and the spikes on the software. Yeah, this is just basically shows, this is just a pilot that we did using some of this software, and it basically shows the kind of things it can tell you. So this is a study that we did where we just presented people with metaphors. These were actually computer-generated metaphors. That was kind of part of another study that we did. And they were attached to the electrodes. And as they saw the metaphors, which are represented by these red lines down here, we see that the EDA, electrodermal activity, responses to each of the metaphors. And here we have an example of a metaphor where there was a strong peak, where there was a strong increase in emotion. And this is the metaphor, art is beautiful love. And we contrast it with this one where there was no response at all emotionally, truth is stunning beauty. And when we look at when we asked afterwards what people thought about the metaphor, everybody thought they both made sense, but this one, they thought it was generated by a human, and this one, they thought it was generated by a computer. And our hypothesis is that there may be a relationship between people's emotional response to metaphor and whether they think it's actually generated by a human or not. The other thing that we're incorporating in, as well as measuring with the electrodes, we also want to ask people, because people maybe have emotional response to metaphor. It could be because they love it, or it could be because they hated it. You don't know, or reminded them of something really shocking, or it could be all sorts of reasons. So we're incorporating this questionnaire as well into that. That's me done for today, I think. So I'm more than happy to welcome questions and things. Thank you. Thank you.